they have shown is rather frightening, that in this middle-class environment, there is abuse and neglect, and that the greater the degree of abuse and neglect, the higher the ACE score, the greater is the prevalence of major diseases shown here. Common diseases and poor health behaviors such as smoking, alcohol use, and things like obesity, mental health disorders, depression, sleep disturbances, poor anger management, anger control, earlier age at first intercourse, problems with sexual relationships, and social adverse behavior, that is antisocial behavior in social situations with higher levels of perceived stress. It's rather frightening because these are lasting consequences for the rest of a person's life. So the National Council has, these are fairly obvious sorts of things. Adult disease prevention begins with reducing early toxic stress. Surprisingly enough, this is not as often appreciated, has not been as often appreciated either by the medical community or by society. That early childhood programs can benefit lifelong health, not just education, but the brain is also important, and promoting physical health, like not having diabetes and obesity develop, can benefit the brain. There are programs that have addressed these. There's something called the Nurse-Family Partnership, and there's the Harlem Children's Zone here in New York City, which are trying to develop programs that get to the child, even the pregnant mother and the family, before the child is born. And then the hope is that the better environment will lead to a better outcome. So finally, I want to mention a number of important concepts. One of them is epigenetics, which is associated with this thing we call biological embedding. It used to mean just simply above the genome, everything that affects the expression of genes. It's where I began my career many years ago, being interested in gene expression regulation. And we know now it involves modifications of histones that lead basic proteins in the nucleus that lead to folding and unfolding of chromatin, that the binding of transcription factors to unfolded chromatin leads to regulation of gene expression, that there can be methylation of the cytosine bases on DNA that doesn't change the genetic code, but alters the ability of this transcription and may increase the degree of folding or unfolding of particular segments of the genome. And then there are something called microRNAs, which are just beginning to be understood, which regulate messenger RNA survival and translation. These are produced by parts of the genome that don't produce proteins or don't have coding information for proteins, but they regulate the ability of those other coding genes to express themselves. And if anybody's interested, you can find on the NOVA series of our U.S. public broadcasting system, put in epigenetics, and you'll get a 13-minute video, which is very informative. And one of the items that is shown on this is that if you look at methylation patterns of DNA, and you look at them in a pair of 3-year-old identical twins, you find on different chromosomes that there's a virtually identical pattern between the two twins, as you would expect, because they have the same genetic material. But when the twins are 50 years old, and they've led separate lives, exposed to different chemicals in the environment, different food, different experiences, you can see that there are quite significant differences between the methylation patterns, which probably begins to help us understand why if one twin, say, has cancer or another disorder, the other twin is not necessarily guaranteed of having that same disorder. Then there are gene variants or alleles that alter the vulnerability to negative experiences. Some of these variants on common genes increase vulnerability, others decrease. The monoamine oxidase gene was studied, and these are studies from Avshalom Caspi at studies in Dunedin, New Zealand. MAO genes influence whether childhood abuse will be transmitted from the abuser to the child. Serotonin transporter genes influence the vulnerability to stress-induced depression. Now, this has portrayed a rather negative picture of these variant genes. Another view, which comes from the work of Tom Boyce and Bruce Ellis, and was very nicely summarized in an article by David Dobbs in The Atlantic magazine, more popular magazine, is that these genes that generate bad outcomes in a bad environment actually may confer positive outcomes in a nurturing environment. And these are called orchid children. So it emphasizes the importance of that nurturing environment. The other allele that is not so sensitive, not so reactive, leads to what have been called dandelion children, children that seem not to be so adversely affected by bad experiences and so forth. So it's an important concept to keep in mind that reinforces the importance of early life nurturing. There's also, of course, the important issue of developing helplessness and learned helplessness. And this has been studied extensively and focuses on the prefrontal cortex and its interactions with the amygdala and the midbrain serotonergic system, work by Marty Seligman at Pennsylvania and Steve Mayer at the University of Colorado. And then there's something I mentioned earlier, which is self-esteem. And it turns out that this investigator now at McGill, Jens Prusner, has shown that people who have low self-esteem have a smaller hippocampus. And in fact, both young subjects and older subjects who have low self-esteem have a smaller hippocampus. They produce higher levels of cortisol. Remember, the hippocampus is involved in shutting off the cortisol response to stress. And this was really revealed by the fact that given a public speaking challenge, these people with low self-esteem produced a lot of cortisol and did not habituate. You remember, habituation to the same stress is one of the, or lack of habituation is one of the potential causes of allostatic load. So this is very challenging and intriguing and needs to be studied further. And finally, or almost finally, there's the notion that all public policies, and for that matter, policies of private enterprise, of business, are health policies, whether it's education, taxation, housing, recreational facilities. This is a publication from the British government, the Atchison Report, done in the early days of the Tony Blair administration. This is a PDF which I'd be happy to send anybody from our MacArthur Network on socioeconomic status and health. There's a wonderful video which can be purchased called Unnatural Causes, which went into great, very elegant and revealing detail about adversity and disadvantage and their effects on health. And then finally, just a thought is that we talk about personalized medicine. And in my experience, this has been most commonly associated with what we can call the pharmacodynamics in relation to genotype, pharmacogenomics, finding out who's going to respond favorably or unfavorably to a certain drug. And this is very important and may expand the use of drugs that don't work the same way on everybody. But there's also other things which reflect what I've been telling you. First, gene-environment interactions are inseparable. We can't just talk about which is more important, nature or nurture. It's a continuum. The social and physical environment has a huge impact, as I've tried to show you, and this relates to policies of government and business, as well as many aspects of our social environment. There are these reactive alleles, the orchids versus dandelions, which we must appreciate, along with epigenetic influences, some of which can be transmitted by behavior, as in maternal care, affecting how the infant develops, but there's also increasing evidence of germline transmission, of modifications, methylation of cytosine residues that may be passed on through the germline from one generation to the other. And then we have the life course and the personal experiences that people have, the individual experiences, something that Anna Louise Kierkegaard has talked about and written about very elegantly, and will speak to you about at the meeting. And then finally, we can talk about prevention. We should talk about prevention as well as remediation and recovery. And there, the top-down interventions that I briefly mentioned must be used along with pharmacologic agents where appropriate. But there must be greater emphasis on in prevention and also in treatment on these top-down interventions such as exercise and better sleep and cognitive behavioral therapy and so forth. There's a very large list of people to acknowledge. I don't expect you to absorb all the names, but you can see it involved scientists at our laboratory and neighboring institutions, other collaborators throughout the world, and of course the MacArthur Network and the National Scientific Council, our laboratory staff, and my wife, Karen Bullock, who has her own neuroimmune physiology program. And finally, there's one more advisor who's very important, who keeps me sane. Thank you very much.